The case of Edith Thompson caught the British legal system on its weakest side. That system is an admirable instrument for ascertaining facts. It is much less efficient in dealing with psychology. The fault lies less with the machinery itself than with those who operate and supervise it. Imagination is the lawyer's bugbear, and literalism his occupational disease. For him, life is governed not by passions, but by statutes, and he likes to interpret individual actions as if each had its origin in icy reason. The dismal consequences may be seen in a string of bad decisions. The human mind cannot be read like a charter party or a bill of sale. Great advocates, of course, are in a class apart. Their success with witnesses and their command over juries are based upon the most penetrating insight. A Carson or a Russell, a Hastings or a Burkitt possesses powers to grasp and understand the thoughts of others which sometimes seem to verge on the uncanny. But in any generation, great advocates are few, while stereotyped lawyers are always two a penny. Rigid, narrow, formalistic, and self-righteous, they are particularly ill-suited to present or sit in judgment on a case which calls for sympathetic knowledge of the world. Edith Thompson was charged with murdering her husband, but not by direct act and not alone. At no time was it suggested that she played a physical part. The Crown acknowledged that she did not lift a finger. Their case was that she urged murder on her lover, that the latter in her presence carried out the wicked deed, and that these two factors taken in conjunction made her under English law a principal in the crime. Much of this thesis was not seriously contested. The lover at least admitted having fought and stabbed the husband. Mrs. Thompson admitted being present when he did. The legal proposition was unarguably sound. So if, as appeared likely all along, Mrs. Thompson's lover was found guilty of murder, her own neck would be forfeit if the jury were convinced that she had spurred him to it with malice and design. This, in its turn, depended upon whether, in their estimation, words that she had used constituted, and were meant to constitute, incitement. Words exist to communicate a meaning, but the meaning inferred by the listener or the reader is not always that intended by the speaker or the writer. There are primary and secondary senses. There are overtones and undertones that are idiosyncratic. There is hyperbole and satire. There is untrammeled fantasy and deliberate make-believe. It is absurd to suppose that every phrase should be literally construed. The man who says, "I thought I'd die" when talking of an illness may well mean that he really anticipated death, but the man who says, "I thought I'd die" about a comic story is merely conveying that it gave him a good laugh. It is only by reference to the character of their author and to the circumstances in which they were employed that one can hope to extract the true significance of words. They must be related, not only to the dictionary, but to life. The lawyers in the Thompson trial brought dictionaries to court, but carefully closed the doors upon the teeming life outside. Few are unfamiliar with the outline of the tragedy that cast a city bookkeeper and Ilford housewife for a role befitting Bernhardt or Regine. Beneath a commonplace plot of jealousy and intrigue lay hidden drama of such spiritual intensity that it fascinates even those most repelled by crime. The story has been told by many practiced pens, and several works of fiction owe to it their inspiration. But the latter, not improperly, have claimed artistic license. Recapitulation of the facts may not be out of place. Late in the evening of October 3rd, 1922, Mrs. Thompson was walking along a quiet road in Ilford with her husband, a respectable shipping clerk, at her side. They were returning from a visit to a West End theater. As they neared their home, a man overtook them. He pushed Mrs. Thompson to one side, stabbed her husband several times, and swiftly disappeared. Mrs. Thompson shrieked and ran for help. A doctor lived nearby. He hurried to the spot, but Percy Thompson was already beyond aid. The police arrived, the body was removed, and a sergeant escorted Mrs. Thompson home. She was much distressed and apparently bewildered. She spoke as though her husband had had some kind of fit, and made no mention of an attack or an attacker. But meanwhile, at the mortuary, they were examining the corpse. Natural death could be instantly ruled out. There were cuts in the ribs, on the chin and lower jaw, and at the right elbow on the inside of the arm. At the back of the head there were 2 vicious-looking stabs, one of which had severed a great artery in the neck. It was this last wound that had caused Percy Thompson's death and established beyond doubt that the hapless man was murdered. Taking all into account, it was difficult to believe that Mrs. Thompson had told them the whole truth. Not unnaturally, the police began to wonder whether the murder had its roots in her domestic life. An inquiry on these lines immediately bore fruit. It led them to a young man by the name of Frederick Bywaters, a P&O employee of excellent repute. They discovered, with commendable energy and speed, that this boy, he was but 20, had been linked with Mrs. Thompson in one form or another for a considerable time. He had known her family since he was a schoolboy. In 1921, he had been on holiday with the Thompsons, and afterward had stayed with them for several weeks at Ilford. He had left as a result of a dispute with Percy Thompson about the latter's behavior to his wife. Since then, he had corresponded with Mrs. Thompson when he was at sea and seen her surreptitiously when he was at home. He had in fact met her in an Aldersgate Street tea shop less than 7 hours before the murder was committed. The police concluded, and their conclusion was well-founded, that Frederick Bywaters was Edith Thompson's lover. He was obviously a man who might be able to assist them in their investigations. On the evening of October 4th, Bywaters was taken to the police station for questioning. When he got there, he found, among others, Mr. Wensley, Inspector Wensley of the Steiny Morrison case, much older now and more exalted in the hierarchy, but just as shrewd and eagle-eyed as ever. While Bywaters denied all connection with the crime and adopted an aggressive, irritated air, Wensley was scrutinizing him minutely. "There are spots on the sleeve of your overcoat," he suddenly remarked. "They look to me like blood." The overcoat was confiscated for chemical examination, which ultimately confirmed the detective's diagnosis, and Bywaters, still protesting, was provisionally detained. A little later the same evening, the police brought Mrs. Thompson to the station. She was not officially placed under restraint, but, in Superintendent Wensley's felicitous phrase, "It was convenient to have her at hand while we were looking for something that would give us a line. So, unbeknownst to each other, in the interests of convenience, lover and mistress slept under the same roof." Mrs. Thompson had not implicated Bywaters at all. Next day, when she was invited to give further information, she still maintained she had seen nobody approach. Bywaters, for his part, made no change in his attitude. The inquiry, which had opened with such impetus and promise, was now merely ticking over and showed signs of being stalled. Late that afternoon, though, an incident occurred that set the wheels back again in motion. It has been described by Wensley as a dramatic interlude, and by at least one famous lawyer as a little trap. Whether by accident or whether by design, Mrs. Thompson was conducted along a corridor where, through an open doorway, she caught a glimpse of Bywaters. The shock cracked her nerve. She broke down, crying, oh God, what can I do? Why did he do it? I did not want him to do it." Mrs. Thompson was at this moment admittedly hysterical, and it is not without interest to dwell upon her words. Why did he do it? I did not want him to do it. That could not have been a calculated stratagem. That was uttered in the agony of impulse, a cry wrung against her will out of the woman's heart. Yet one would be hard put to it, to draft another sentence expressing so precisely the gist of her defense. But understandably, the police were not concerned with her defense. They were only concerned with the effect of this on Bywaters. Why did he do it? That was all the lead required. The notebooks were whipped out, the formal warning given, and within a few minutes, Mrs. Thompson signed a statement naming Bywaters as the man who had scuffled with her husband. From that moment, Bywaters was halfway to the gallows. Faced with this complete reversal of the situation, he made a further statement, from which he never struggled free. "I waited," he said, "for Mrs. Thompson and her husband. I pushed her to one side, also pushing him further up the street. I said to him, 'You have got to separate from your wife.' He said, 'No.' I said, 'You will have to.' We struggled, I took my knife from my pocket, and we fought, and he got the worst of it. Mrs. Thompson must have been spellbound, for I saw nothing of her during the fight. I ran away. The reason I fought Thompson was because he never acted like a man to his wife. He always seemed several degrees lower than a snake. I loved her and could not go on seeing her leading that life. I did not intend to kill him. I only meant to injure him. Bywaters prefaced this statement with an important affirmation. Mrs. Edith Thompson was not aware of my movements on Tuesday evening, October 3rd. It may have been true, but one should say this about Bywaters. He tried his best to shield Mrs. Thompson, and continued to do so gallantly, though clumsily, to the end. His efforts, however, met with no success. The police had made their minds up to bring them both to trial, and each was duly charged with Percy Thompson's murder. The case against Bywaters was simple, factual, and tolerably clear. Apart from noting that on trial he introduced somewhat belatedly the theme of self-defense, it need not concern us further. The case against Mrs. Thompson had at first been non-existent. All that could be said against her was that she had lied in a futile attempt to protect and cover Bywaters. That might make her an accessory after the fact. It could not bring her into danger of the rope. What could? At the Old Bailey, the judge was to express it in these words. "You will not convict her," he enjoined the jury, "unless you are satisfied that she and he agreed that this man should be murdered when he could be, and she knew he was going to do it, and directed him to do it, and by arrangement between them, he was doing it." There had been nothing whatever in Mrs. Thompson's conduct to suggest that she possessed foreknowledge of the crime. She had seemed serene and normal to companions at the theater. She had made frantic exertions to procure medical aid. Most striking touch of all, a householder who lived close by the scene of the assault had heard her cry, "Oh, don't! Oh, don't!" in a most piteous tone. If that was merely play-acting to impress an unseen audience, to dissociate herself from Bywaters' attack, why did she say afterward she had seen nobody there? How could the police prove Mrs. Thompson's complicity? How could they establish the existence of a plot? How could they show, with the material available, that Bywaters had acted at her bidding and direction? The answer is they couldn't. And if nothing had turned up, the prosecution of the woman would have been quietly withdrawn. No self-respecting counsel would have agreed to open it. But something did turn up. In a routine inspection of Bywaters' belongings, the police unearthed and seized 65 letters written by Mrs. Thompson to her lover, and sometimes couched in extraordinary terms. These letters became the salient feature of the trial, and were certainly the arbiter of Edith Thompson's fate. One must now turn aside from the action of the story. It is the letters one must study, the letters and their writer, for they throw light on her just as she throws light on them. Edith Thompson was no ordinary woman of the suburbs, occupied and satisfied by the dreary daily round. She was a remarkable and complex personality, endowed with signal attributes of body and of mind. She had intelligence, vitality, a natural grace and poise, sensitiveness, humor, and, illumining all these, that quintessential femininity that fascinates the male. If the list had only ended there, her tale would have been different. She might not have found happiness. She would not have met her doom. But there was one further element in Edith Thompson's makeup. She had the instincts of an artist, and lacking the artist's outlet, she used them in a manner that led to her undoing. The friends and acquaintances of her own social circle doubtless envied Edith Thompson the good fortune of her lot. She had a sober, thrifty husband, a pleasant little home, a responsible and well-paid job she had held for several years. Indeed, she earned as much as, or perhaps more than, did her husband, which could hardly fail to gratify her taste for independence. "She is a very capable woman," said her employer at the trial. "With her business capacity, she could get employment anywhere." But the comfortable monotony of Ilford and the city did not appease the restlessness in Edith Thompson's soul. There was nothing in either to fire imagination, as the artist in her so avidly desired. Her existence was prosaic and uneventful, her husband unresponsive and humdrum. She lived in and through novels which she devoured till they were part of her. But what were other people's novels, after all? Time was slipping by. In 1921, she had been married 6 whole years. Soon, all too soon, she would be an old woman without even the solace of remembered joys. Unconsciously, but ardently, she sought some focus, some rallying point, and symbol of her appetite for life. She found it in Bywaters. He was 8 years her junior, hardly more than a youth, but conspicuously virile and handsome in a heavy, sensual way. She raised this earthy lover to the heights. She breathed into their love a flame so fierce that even Bywaters was transported and transfigured. It was Antony and Cleopatra. It was Romeo and Juliet. It was every great romance in the chronicles of time. Fact and reality were no more than a cue for the exuberant fancy of Edith Thompson's mind. When the true story fell short, she improved it in her letters, until it was a story worth an artist's while, a story replete with sacrifice and violence, with colorful suitors and relentless poisoning wives, with all the trappings of the novels she had read and all the delirium of the love she'd imagined. This was the driving force behind the famous letters which the prosecution used to get their writer hanged. One does not seek to whitewash Mrs. Thompson, nor to try to gloss over whatever were her sins. But none can understand her who fails to realize that she was a woman of quality whose talents were frustrated. A notion has found currency that Mrs. Thompson's letters contained little else but equivocal and sinister allusions. This notion runs quite contrary to the fact. From August 1921 to October 1922, she wrote to Bywaters several scores of times. The letters she received from him during the same period were, with 3 exceptions, prudently destroyed. Of the 65 from her remaining in existence, more than half were not introduced in evidence by the Crown, because there was nothing in them, no reference, no phrase, which could possibly be quoted to Mrs. Thompson's detriment. Of those that were exhibited, 32 in all, only fractions consisted of disputable stuff. More than 9/10 was as transparently innocent of crime as is the private talk of lovers anywhere on earth. Most love letters, however skilled the writer, are unreadable except by those to whom they are addressed. In making herself an exception to this rule, Mrs. Thompson gave a further proof of her peculiar gifts. Sometimes she looked forward to Bywaters' return. "It is 4 whole weeks today since you went, and there is still another 4 more to go. I wish I could go to sleep for all that time and wake up just in time to dress and sit by the fire, waiting for you to come in on March 18th. I don't think I'd come to meet you, darling. It always seems so ordinary and casual for me to see you after such a long time in the street. I shall always want you to come straight to our home and take me in both your arms." Sometimes she looked back into the past, half gratified, half fearful. "I'll always love you. If you are dead. If you have left me, even if you don't still love me, I shall always love you. If things should go badly with us, I shall always have this past year to look back upon and feel that then I lived. I never did before and never shall again. Sometimes she is despondent and reproachful. He does not write, or talk, as she always calls it, often or expansively enough. What an utterly absurd thing to say to me. Don't be too disappointed. You can't possibly know what it feels like to wait and wait each day, every little hour, for something that means life to you, and then not get it. You told me from Dover that you were going to talk to me for a long time at Marseille, and now you put it off to Port Said. You force me to conclude that the life you lead away from England is all-absorbing, and that you haven't time nor inclination to remember England or anything England holds. There were at least 5 days you could have talked to me about, if you only spared me 5 minutes out of each day. But what is the use of me saying all this? It's the same always. I'm never meant to have anything I expect or want. If I am unjust, I'm sorry. But I can't feel anything at present. Only just as if I have had a blow on the head and I'm stunned. The disappointment, no, more than that. The utter despair is too much to bear. I would sooner go under today than anything. All I can hope is that you will never feel like I do today. Perhaps I ought not to have written this, but how I feel and what I think I must tell you always. There is no mistaking the dynamic of her passion, nor her untutored power of conveying it in words. Let's be ourselves. Always darling us, there can never be any misunderstandings then. Doesn't matter if it's harder. You said it was our fate against each other. We only have willpower when we are in accord, not when we are in conflict. Tell me if this is how you feel. With you, darling, there can never be any pride to stand in the way. It melts in the flame of a great love. I finished with pride, a long time ago. The city bookkeeper's pen flew over the paper. She was buoyant, depressed, ecstatic, apprehensive. But over and over again, a bogey rose to scare her. He was 20. She was 28. My veriest own lover, I always think about the difference. Sometimes, when I'm happy for a little while, I forget, but I always remember very soon. Shall I always be able to keep you? 8 years is such a long time. It's not now, it's later. When I'm Joan, and you're not grown old enough to be Darby. When you've got something that you've never had before and something that you're so happy to have found, you're always afraid of it flying away. That's how I feel about your love. Don't ever take your love away from me, darling. I never want to lose it and live. Life, it is clear, inflicted many torments on this burning spirit with aspirations unfulfilled, but there was always one escape. Aren't books a consolation and a solace? We ourselves die and live in the books we read while we are reading them, and then, when we have finished, the books die, and we live, or exist, just drag on through years and years, until when? Who knows? I'm beginning to think no one does. No, not even you and I. We are not the shapers of our destinies. I'll always love you, darling. We are not the shapers of our destinies. It has a terrible and prophetic ring. She wrote always a great deal about the books she was reading or wanted him to read. She did not merely tell him whether she had enjoyed them. She did not even confine herself to mentioning the theme, but habitually made minute analyses of the characters and discussed the motive springs that underlay their actions. She formed and ventilated fervid views about these fictional creations. The man Lacosta in the trail of a 98, he was so vile I didn't think of him at all, and I'd rather not now, darling. I enjoyed John Chilcote ever so much. I admire the force in the man that made him tackle such a position against such odds. No, I don't agree with you about Belladonna, darling. I hate her. I hate to think of her. I don't think other people made her what she was. That sensual, pleasure-loving, greedy Belladonna was always there. If she had originally been different, a good man like Nigel would have altered her, darling. She never knew what it was to be denied anything. She never knew goodness, as you and I know it. She was never interested in a good man, or any man, unless he could appease her sensual nature. She doesn't seem a woman to me. She seems abnormal. A monster. A reply to some stricture on the ending of a novel shows the depth of her absorption in imaginary worlds. The endings are not the story. Do as I do. Forget the end. Lose yourself in the characters and the story, and in your own mind make your own end. Such was the prevailing mental climate of these letters that are passed down to posterity as the effusions of a murderess. One must now examine a few specific passages selected by the Crown as indicative of guilt. These passages, of course, should not be read in isolation. They ought to be read, as the lawyers did not read them, within the context of the letters as a whole. Then and only then one has a chance of judging whether, according to the precept she herself laid down, it was in her own mind that Mrs. Thompson made her end. The compromising words, faithfully copied into counsel's briefs by thrilled and awestruck typists, were singularly artless if they ministered to crime. Does a cold-blooded conspirator, pondering every move, ignore the risk of letters getting lost or going astray? Does a party to a plot, receiving reckless letters, studiously preserve the evidence of guilt? Such modifying reflections usually come as afterthoughts. First interpretations are rigorously literal. One can well imagine detective eyes popping out of detective heads when they originally lighted upon passages like this. I used the light bulb 3 times, but the 3rd time he found a peace. So I have given it up, until you come home. Who is he? Who could it be except the lady's husband? What was the light bulb, and in what way was it used? The light bulb? He found a peace. Wasn't powdered glass a familiar form of poisoning? As they read on, letter after letter, Scotland Yard's suspicions deepened into certainty. I was buoyed up with the hope of the light bulb, and I used a lot. Big pieces, too, not powdered, and it has no effect. I quite expected to be able to send that cable, but no, nothing has happened from it. I know I feel I shall never get him to take a sufficient quantity of anything bitter. References to a bitter taste frequently recur. He puts great stress on the fact of the tea tasting bitter, as if something had been put in it, he says. Now I think whatever else I try in it again will still taste bitter. He will recognize it and be more suspicious still. And if the quantity is still not successful, it will injure any chance I may have of trying when you come home. Though other extracts gained equal prominence at the trial, one surmises that in the initial stage, these furnished the key. They laid a firm-looking foundation for a practicable theory which was confidently applied to unriddle ambiguities. By the aid of this explanatory touchstone, each could be resolved to favor the Crown case. This time really will be the last you will go away. Like things are, won't it? We said it before, Darlant, I know, and we failed. But there will be no failure this next time, Darlant. There must not be. I'm telling you, if things are the same again, then I'm going with you. Wherever it is. If it's to sea, I am coming too. And if it's to nowhere, I'm also coming, Darlant. You'll never leave me behind again. Never, unless things are different. What did Mrs. Thompson mean, unless things are different? Obvious, said the Crown. She meant, unless we've done the murder. I ask you again to think out all the plans and methods for me. What did Mrs. Thompson mean, plans and methods? Obvious, said the Crown. She meant ways and means of murder. Yes, Darlant, you are jealous of him. But I want you to be. He has the right by law to all that you have the right to by nature and by love. Yes, Darlant, be jealous, so much that you will do something desperate. What did Mrs. Thompson mean, do something desperate? Obvious, said the Crown. She meant brace yourself for murder. If some of these inferences seem prejudiced or forced, this must be said in fairness to the Crown. Make one assumption, and it is true that all else follows. If what one terms the key passages are taken at face value, if every statement in them is accepted as a fact, if each of the incidents described by Mrs. Thompson is assumed to have occurred exactly as she says, then there can be only one possible conclusion. Mrs. Thompson had herself tried to kill her husband and had been imploring Bywaters to succeed where she had failed. That was the conclusion, granted the assumption. But was the assumption justified that Mrs. Thompson never indulged in flights of fancy and that all her reporting was meticulously exact? The trial, so far as she was personally concerned, became a committee of inquiry to decide this single point. The case of the King against Bywaters and Thompson began at the Old Bailey on December 6, 1922. A row of well-known counsel faced Mr. Justice Shearman. Sir Henry Curtis Bennet, then rivaling Marshall Hall in public esteem as a defender, was instructed to appear on behalf of Mrs. Thompson. Mr. Cecil Whiteley, an agile-minded and energetic advocate, undertook the well-nigh hopeless task of representing Bywaters. The Crown had thought fit to nominate a law officer, a move which secured for them the right to the last word. Their choice fell on Thomas Inskip, a learned abstract lawyer who in the whirligig of politics had been made Solicitor General. This case was not, one may conjecture, an assignment Inskip relished. His capacities were misemployed, his shortcomings exposed. He displayed as little grasp of human impulses and frailties as he later did of strategy when Minister of Defense. Interest in the trial was not confined to those who, through craving for sensation or mere prurient curiosity, can never resist the double bait of murder and of sex. The unusual issue that had to be determined, the fact that the solution lay in the temper of a mind. a feeling that Mrs. Thompson was a highly gifted woman who, innocent or otherwise, would repay attentive study. This made a gulf between the case and the average murder trial, like the gulf between the average thriller and one by Graham Greene. The best as well as the worst were attracted into court, and some notable figures from literature and Fleet Street took their place among the audience assembled for the drama. The drama opened in most undramatic circumstances. The scene had been set and the characters introduced. Bywaters and Mrs. Thompson had been brought into the dock and eyed from every angle like a pair of movie stars. The 12 who were to try them had answered to their names, and all had seemed in readiness for a great forensic battle. Then Sir Henry Curtis Bennet spoke in quiet, even tones. The judge gave a brief order. An official led the puzzled jury out of court. The defense were raising a preliminary objection. They wished to argue on a point of law. This argument took place, as such arguments do, in a deceptive atmosphere of academic calm. Points of law are not contrived to gratify the public thirst for clamor and excitement. They may be as fateful, though, as contests more spectacular. The routine seldom varies. An erudite submission by one counsel, an erudite counter-submission by another, much reading out of large books, a Latin tag or two, and then a gentle pronouncement by the judge, which may create a precedent and terminate a life. The significance of Sir Henry's point of law cannot be overstated. He was contending that the letters, the all-important letters, were not admissible as evidence and should be excluded from the trial. The rules governing the admissibility of evidence are something of a mystery to the man in the street, who is apt to think of them as lawyers' hocus-pocus. This view is unwarranted. Though they sometimes seem, and sometimes are, mechanical and arbitrary in operation, such rules are based on long and rich experience of what is required to protect the individual. Reliance upon them betrays neither guilt nor weakness. It is a claim upon the birthright of a British citizen. To invoke the aid of any rule which might shut out the letters was the plain duty of Mrs. Thompson's counsel. Success in this would be decisive. There would be no evidence, no need for further argument, no element of risk. If the Crown could be deprived of the right to read and use the correspondence bundle in Sir Thomas Inskip's brief, the case against Mrs. Thompson would be virtually at an end. Curtis Bennet's submission was necessarily technical and interesting only to scholars of the law. Briefly, he said this, that the letters, by their nature, could only throw light upon intent. That intent is not an issue unless there is an act to be explained. That the Crown could not prove and did not set out to prove that Mrs. Thompson committed any act in the murder. Hence, said Curtis Bennet, the letters were irrelevant. Hence, they ought not to be admitted into evidence. But, said the judge, it is alleged that the lady was present at the murder. Are the letters not then evidence of her felonious intent? No, my lord, said Curtis Bennet, not on this indictment. I agree, he added, that I should not be able to object to the letters on the second indictment. In fact, 5 separate charges stood against Mrs. Thompson. Charges of murder, of soliciting to murder, of inciting to conspire to murder, of administering poison with intent to murder, and of administering a destructive thing with intent to murder. The last 4 had been deferred pending the verdict on the first, though it might be assumed that in the event of an acquittal, the Crown would not proceed with the subsidiary charges. Cecil Whiteley, who at Bywater's desire accorded all support throughout to Mrs. Thompson's case, also objected to the admission of the letters. In reply, the Solicitor General said that the letters were evidence not merely of intent, but of incitement. "This is a crime," he declared, "where one hand struck the blow, and we want to show by these letters that Mrs. Thompson's mind conceived and incited it." The judge accepted this submission and rejected those of the defense. "The question is a very difficult one," he said, "but I think that these letters are admissible. It was a decision firmly based in law, but it proved in the long run inimical to justice. So the letters were in as lawyers say colloquially, and the Crown exploited them down to the last syllable. The Solicitor General made them the burden of his somewhat undistinguished opening address. At the prosecution's close, they were read in their entirety, a proceeding which occupied most of the second day. They were put piecemeal to the prisoners when they went into the box, not only to Mrs. Thompson, but to Bywaters as well. She was invited to explain what she had meant, he to explain what he had taken her to mean. In the course of this repetitive and time-consuming process, the jury could have learned the key passages by heart, together with the innuendos proffered by the Crown. But there was another consequence that favored the defense. As the background gradually filled in and a fuller, clearer picture of the tragedy took shape, much that had been quoted acquired a fresh perspective. It transpired, for instance, that the lovers, faced with the barrier of Mrs. Thompson's marriage, had together discussed the possibility of suicide. One strongly suspects that this was just another piece of Mrs. Thompson's mania for self-dramatization, and that there was no real intention of carrying it out. But the vital point to mark is that it was at least discussed. There were expressions in the letters not susceptible of any other meaning. All I could think about last night was that compact we made. Shall we have to carry it through? Don't let us, darling. I'd like to live and be happy. Not for a little while, but for all the while you still love me. Death seemed horrible last night. When you think about it, darling, it does seem a horrible thing to die, when you have never been happy, really happy for one little minute. They had also canvassed the idea of persuading Percy Thompson to separate from his wife. I said exactly what you told me to, and he replied that he knew that's what I wanted, and he was not giving it to me. It would make things far too easy for both of you, meaning you and me, especially for you, he said. Mrs. Thompson had been ready, or had said that she was ready, to run away without warning from her husband and her home. Darlingest, find me a job abroad. I'll go tomorrow and not say I was going to a soul and not have one little regret. Suicide, separation, leaving England with her lover. Might it have been these objects and not murder at all that had taken such a grip of Mrs. Thompson's mind? I ask you to think out the plans and methods for me. Plans and methods for killing her husband or herself. You'll never leave me again unless things are different. Different because Percy Thompson had been killed, or because he had at last agreed to separation. Be jealous so that you will do something desperate. Murder the husband, or take away the wife. It became glaringly, almost embarrassingly apparent that many of the phrases which the Crown had singled out were open to quite credible alternative constructions. But this merely trimmed the edges of the sprawling, straggling case which the Solicitor General had placed before the jury. The key passages were not affected nor dislodged. I used the light bulb 3 times, but the 3rd time he found a piece. I feel I shall never get him to take a sufficient quantity. Whatever else I try in it will still taste bitter. No stretching of the sense could make these refer to suicide or matrimonial separation or slipping off abroad. For these there was but one excuse conformable with innocence, that they were fabulous, air-drawn, fantastical inventions, the figments of Mrs. Thompson's over-fertile brain. This, in a sentence, was the case for the defense. It was not a case that could be built up far in cross-examination. It was not a case that could be tested much by pondering the facts. The problem was to estimate a woman's imagination, and to solve it, the jury were thrown back upon their own. There were, however, 2 solid, tangible realities to guide them in their psychopathological explorations. The first was more revealing of her character than anything Mrs. Thompson could have said about herself. In one of her letters, she had treated Bywaters to a particularized description of a family upset. Her sister Avis had informed her, she declared, that her indignant husband had been down to see her father and told him everything about all the rows we have had over you, but, observed the painstaking reverence for detail, she did not mention he said anything about the first real one on August 1st, so I suppose he kept that back to suit his own ends. Mrs. Thompson's father, Avis was alleged to have reported, had expressed an intention of talking to his daughter. But I went down and nothing happened. I told Avis I should tell them off if they said anything to me. Now Mrs. Thompson's father and sister were witnesses at the trial. The latter for the defense, the former for the Crown. Curtis Bennett questioned them both about this highly circumstantial story. "Did Thompson," he asked the father, "ever come to you and make a complaint about the conduct of Bywaters with your daughter?" "Never," was the reply. "That is the purest imagination." "Is there any truth whatever in this story?" "There is none. As a matter of fact, I had no idea that my daughter and her husband were not on good terms." The sister, in turn, was equally emphatic. Curtis Bennett read aloud the passage from the letter, with its constant and plausible mention of herself. "I rang Avis. Dad was going to talk to me," Avis said. "I told Avis I should tell them off." "Is there any truth in that at all?" Curtis Bennett inquired of Avis. "There is none whatever." "Did you ever tell her anything like that?" "I did not." "Did it ever happen?" "It did not. It had never happened, and Avis had never told her." Yet Mrs. Thompson's account of this imaginary incident has a realism few can infuse into the truth. What a little miracle of unconscious art prompted that reference to the first real row in August. Who could believe that a story so minutely related wasn't true? Almost certainly it half convinced its author, and this, I have no doubt, was its principal design. More important than anything, more important even than her hold upon her lover, was the endless romantic tale that Edith Thompson spun, and deep in the heart of which she lived a life apart. The second signpost was erected by a witness of great influence whose word, as we have seen before, was magical with juries. There had been an exhumation of Percy Thompson's body with the express object of examining for poison. Bernard Spilsbury conducted the post-mortem. He found precisely nothing. There was no trace or sign of any poison. There was no trace or sign of any glass. There was no indication that either one or the other had ever been administered. The Crown produced this tremendous piece of evidence in a shabby, grudging, discreditable way. They tried to make it seem that the post-mortem was nugatory by stressing that all traces might have disappeared. But the exhumation wasn't made without hope of finding something. The most famous of pathologists had said that there was nothing, and the Crown would have done better to have faced up to the fact and not tried to look as though they expected nothing anyway. All those pieces of glass, I used quite a lot. All those light bulbs, all that stuff that tasted bitter. Like the story about Avis and the family upset, its unaffected naturalness insisted on belief. But science, unimpressionable science, using its steely, material approach, could find no evidence that this transpontine melodrama had ever been performed, except in Mrs. Thompson's mind. The Crown case had closed. Bywaters had given evidence with the pugnacity of despair and tightened the noose already slung around his throat. Now Curtis Bennett faced a grave and vexing question. Ought Mrs. Thompson to go into the box? Criminal charges must be strictly proved. It is not enough for the Crown to say, "Look, we have kicked up a great dust of suspicion. You, the accused, are bound to lay that dust. You must take the oath and submit yourself to cross-examination." A more exacting onus lies upon the Crown. To establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. If they are incapable of doing that unassisted, the prisoner will be well advised to hold his peace. As matters stood, had the Crown discharged this onus on the trial of Mrs. Thompson? Their case against her was based solely on her letters. Suppose Curtis Bennett had adopted a bold line. Suppose he had called no evidence, addressed the jury, pointed to Mrs. Thompson's bent for vivid storytelling, and challenged them to convict her on the letters by themselves. Would they have dared? Curtis Bennett's dilemma has been that of many advocates since the Criminal Evidence Act was passed in 1898. Until then, as noted in the case of Mrs. Maybrick, no prisoner could give sworn evidence in his own behalf. That often placed him at a disadvantage that the Act was intended to remove. But in removing one, it introduced another. In theory, the prisoner now enjoys an option. He gives evidence or not, exactly as he likes. But in practice, his election to keep out of the box will generally result in adverse comment by the judge and an assumption by the jury that he has got something to hide. All this had to be weighed. If the final decision had been wholly Curtis Bennett's, if his client had placed herself entirely in his hands, one is disposed to guess that she would never have been called, but heavy pressure was brought to bear upon his judgment. Mrs. Thompson herself had decided to give evidence. She would hear no advice and brook no denial. Mrs. Thompson's appearance in the box did her irreparable harm. It was not that she offended in style or personality. Nothing could divest her of her native distinction. It was not that she brought forward any new and dreadful fact. Hardly once during her testimony did she break onto fresh ground. She certainly did not succumb to the acumen of Inskip. His cross-examination, although long, was uninspired. The cause of Mrs. Thompson's failure as a witness must be sought in some sphere less obvious than these. I myself think that, despite the seeming paradox, it was due to the acuteness and the strength of her perceptions. One may follow the thought process that set her on her course. The jury must be made to see the motive for the letters. She knew the motive best, so it was best that she should tell them. Looking on each day from the seclusion of the dock, or brooding at night in the fastness of her cell, she felt certain she could make them understand. But once face to face with the unforthcoming 12, hope drained suddenly, like blood out of her heart. It is my belief she realized, in the moment of essaying it, the utter futility of her self-appointed task. She learned the last agony afflicting those on trial, knowing it is impossible to get oneself believed. How could she put it? How could she find words? How could she convince them that those letters to her lover consisted in part of sheer escapist fiction, invented and written to compensate a little for the drab, dull existence to which the 12 belonged? She perceived this, and she faltered. Her mind refused to act. She pathetically took refuge in the barest of denials. "Did you ever put anything in your husband's tea?" "No." "Did he ever complain that his tea tasted bitter?" "No." "Did you ever intend to use an electric light bulb?" "No." Did you ever use one?" "Never." "But why write and say you had?" That was the point, and it was never really dealt with. Vaguely and feebly, when pressed upon the matter, Mrs. Thompson talked of holding Bywater's affection. This does not convey to me the ring of authenticity, and doubtless it appeared even more inadequate at the time. It sounds hollow and would leave the jury still demanding why. Why the fantasy? Why the make-believe? Mrs. Thompson could not tell them, she who knew so well. Responsibility lay heavy on Sir Henry Curtis Bennet. 4 days of prim sententiousness and virtuous moralizing could not fail to magnify that attitude of censoriousness so readily adopted by humans in the mass. It was on the whole an unfavorable atmosphere in which Mrs. Thompson's counsel began his final speech. He made an admirable and sustained attempt to dissipate this atmosphere, to rescue his client from the dead hand of the law. He projected Mrs. Thompson as she could not project herself. "Am I right or wrong," he asked, "in saying that this woman is one of the most extraordinary personalities that you or I have ever met?" Bywaters truly described her. Did he not, as a woman who lived a sort of life I don't suppose any of you live, an extraordinary life of make-believe in an atmosphere created by something which has made an impression on her brain? She reads a book, and she imagines herself one of the characters. She is always leading an extraordinary life of novels. At last, the real Mrs. Thompson was being put before the jury. With unpretentious force, Curtis Bennet drew a portrait of a woman whose mental horizon did not end at Chancery Lane. He took the letters themselves as the best corroboration of this reading of her mind. Have you ever heard more beautiful language of love? Such things have been very seldom put by pen upon paper. This is the woman you have to deal with, not some ordinary woman. She is one of those striking personalities that stand out. Tactfully, the defender endeavored to diminish the whipped-up prejudice of moral disapproval. "Thank God," he cried. This is not a court of morals, because if everybody immoral was brought here, I would never be out of it, nor would you. We are men and women of the world." When Mrs. Thompson had stepped down from the box, the darkness of doom enwrapped her like a mantle. Now it was growing lighter with every passing minute. As Curtis Bennett developed and enlarged upon his theme, his words always homely, his voice always sonorous, his burly figure like a tower of strength incarnate foursquare to the world, he produced an immense and discernible impression on the throng of spectators crammed into the court. The jury's response was more difficult to gauge, because juries, in the limelight's glare, try to be impassive. But at the afternoon's end, when he broke off his speech upon the bidding of the clock, Curtis Bennett had good cause for self-congratulation. There was reason to think he had made substantial headway. It was a Saturday, and all through the weekend recess it would be his words that were ringing in the jury's ears. He had done much to reverse the drift towards disaster, and he could confidently look forward to resuming on the Monday in a court altogether more cordially inclined. It seems that this transformation had also struck the bench, and that the bench did not look upon the change with satisfaction. For as counsel and solicitors were tying up their papers and the crowd was shuffling in readiness to move, Mr. Justice Shearman delivered a last word. It is not uncommon for a judge to warn the jury against jumping to conclusions before hearing both sides. It is very uncommon, one would have liked to say unheard of, for a judge to interject antagonistic comment in the middle of a closing speech by counsel for the prisoner. Mrs. Thompson's evil star accorded her that judge. "Members of the jury," said his lordship, "before the court rises for the day, I wish to offer you this advice. Of course, you will not make up your minds until you have heard the whole case." In fact, the evidence had long since been completed. All that remained before the jury's verdict was the Crown's reply and the judge's summing up. If this piece of advice meant anything at all, it meant, don't decide about Sir Henry's plea until you have heard Sir Thomas Inskip and me. The only other thing is, having regard to the surroundings for so many days, by all means look at the atmosphere and try to understand what the letters mean, but you should not forget that you are in a court of justice trying a vulgar and common crime. In describing this amazing case as vulgar and common, Mr. Justice Shearman spoke for the profession he adorned. Curtis Bennett and those like him are rich and rare exceptions, rich in their humanity, rare in their comprehension. The representative lawyers, seeing no further than their notebooks, one after the other, expressed agreement with the judge. "I ask you," said Inskip in his last speech to the jury, "to treat this as an ordinary case." "It is squalid and indecent," said the Lord Chief Justice later, presiding in the Court of Criminal Appeal. "It is essentially a commonplace and unedifying case." These inane pronouncements, uttered in all solemnity by grown men, are a measure of the lawyer's incapacity to fathom the depths beneath the surface that they skim. They had missed or ignored the vital feature of the case, that it was highly unusual and possibly unique because of the character of the feminine protagonist. But the whole affair provoked their sour displeasure. It didn't fit inside a legal frame. It raised vast questions of sex and of psychology foreign to their experience and repugnant to their tastes. Because it was beyond them, they took refuge in aloofness. They branded it contemptuously as ordinary and common. Lawyers react thus to every manifestation of imaginative artistry or passionate desire. It is their sole defense. You can hear them crying commonplace after Beatrice and Dante and stigmatizing Heloise as a vulgar little slut. These legalistic preconceptions were painfully apparent in Mr. Justice Shearman's long and ill-phrased summing up. He was bitterly hostile to Mrs. Thompson from the start. He dismissed her letters breezily as gush, though if his own command of language had been comparable with hers, he would not have dropped so often into slipshod imprecision, but his drift was plain enough. "It's a common, or ordinary charge," he told the jury, "of a wife and an adulterer murdering her husband. You are told that this is a case of a great love. Take one of the letters as a test." He took one and pointed out this solitary sentence. "He has the right by law to all that you have a right to, by nature and by love." This had excited the judge's indignation. "If that means anything," he said, "it means that the love of a husband for his wife is something improper because marriage is acknowledged by the law, and that the love of a woman for her lover, illicit and clandestine, is something great and noble. That, needless to say, is not what it means at all." Mrs. Thompson was not generalizing about love and marriage. She was writing particularly and solely of herself. In her life, the only love that mattered was unlawful. But where does she suggest this is a universal rule? Even fellow lawyers might be loath to defend this singular specimen of Mr. Justice Shearman's logic. But its author had no qualms, and the full force of his moral reprobation was visited on Mrs. Thompson's head. "I am certain," he said to the jury, "that you, like any other right-minded persons, will be filled with disgust at such a notion. Let us get rid of all that atmosphere and try this case in an ordinary common-sense way. Calls for common sense, plain common sense principles, and common-sense considerations were repeated at intervals like ritualistic incantations. No one, of course, objects to common sense, but the judge's application of it was frequently bewildering. It was apparently common sense that made him warn the jury against Curtis Bennett's flights of imagination, when imagination on the part of others was so sorely needed and so sadly lacking. It was apparently common sense that enabled him to see why two people agreeing to murder don't make that agreement when anybody is listening, but prevented him from seeing the parallel presumption that they don't put their agreement into writing either. It was apparently common sense that made him speak of this silly but at the same time wicked affection. Wicked, possibly, but was silly the apt term for a passion so compelling that it drove a man to kill? In any event, and contrary to popular belief, it is not every problem that common sense can solve. Some require uncommon sense, and Mrs. Thompson's case was essentially one of these. The jury should have received an impartial direction, free from irrelevant lectures upon ethics, and emphasizing that their primary concern was to grasp the tendencies of Mrs. Thompson's mind. Instead, they were fobbed off with a good many opinions that had been better unexpressed, a string of pious platitudes on sexual behavior, and a total disregard of the question of psychology. The result could be foreseen. It may be said you blame Inskip, who was subject to the judge. You blame the judge, who was subject to appeal. Why not blame the jury, which was not subject to anything? I do, but to a much smaller degree for reasons which involve a short excursus upon juries. The 12 average people who occupy a jury box are, almost always, 12 frightened people too. They are little folk, leading little lives, scared of policemen and respectful to solicitors, who are suddenly called to responsibility and power. They are generally 1/4 proud, 3/4 apprehensive, and desperately anxious for guidance from the law. To them, the law is embodied in the judge. Counsel, with their wigs and gowns and sprucely starched white bands, inevitably take rank as superior beings, but they are identified with the fortunes of a side. His lordship has a pure and godlike quality. Placed physically and spiritually above the sordid strife, his lightest word reverberates around Mount Sinai. It follows that in the overwhelming majority of cases, juries follow the judge when he gives a definite lead. There are exceptions. Occasionally, a judge will overdo it. He will espouse one party's cause so heatedly and fiercely that the jury find against him because they don't think it fair play. Even this happens only with a panel of strong jurors, or one strong juror who dominates the rest. For the most part, judges get the verdicts that they want. It is all the easier for a jury to accept the judge's promptings if these coincide with their own spontaneous instinct. And instinct in a jury is generally clear-cut. It urges them to vindicate their corporate rectitude. They like to distribute penalties and rewards, and to uphold good morals as a byproduct of verdicts. There is one further element in the average jury's makeup, a propensity to condemn what they cannot understand. An unseen handicap rests upon a prisoner who in life or mind or habit appears alien to themselves. They are more at home and therefore more forbearing with bookmakers and licensees than with prophets or with poets, it will be seen that Mrs. Thompson had the worst of every deal. The judge was against her. She was technically dissolute. Her own counsel had described her as living a sort of life I don't suppose any of you live. What chance had she against this combination of misfortunes? They gave her longer thought, though, than had been given to Mrs. Maybrick. For 2 hours and 10 minutes the jury remained out, striving to do justice according to their lights. Even when she cried out, "Oh God, I am not guilty," even when the judge assumed the black cap of her novels, even when she found herself receiving the sad privileges imposed on the condemned, Mrs. Thompson cannot have believed that she would die, nor did a host of others. She had struck no blow, she had played no part. The intention of her letters was in strenuous dispute. A petition raised on her behalf was signed by many thousands, and most people confidently expected a reprieve. It never came. The legal system and its affiliated offices continued to react with a species of cold frenzy at Mrs. Thompson's name. No yielding to clamor, an example must be made. And so it came about that the British Home Secretary, whose forerunners and successors have restored to society so many brutalized and violent murderers, turned a deaf ear to the plea of Edith Thompson and permitted her to hang for the glory of the law. We ourselves die and live in the books we read while we are reading them, and then, when we have finished, the books die and we live until when? Who knows? We are not the shapers of our destinies. The Thompson verdict is now recognized as bad, and the trial from which it sprang stands out as an example of the evils that may flow from an attitude of mind. There was no failure of law. There was no failure of procedure. There was no failure to observe and abide by all the rules. It was from first to last a failure in human understanding, a failure to grasp and comprehend a personality not envisaged in the standard legal textbooks and driven by forces more powerful and eternal than those that are studied at the Inns of Court.